Good morning, 8th grade Bible class. Just want to say good job on your Daniel and Esther worksheets. I've graded them all and got them back to you, and you guys did very, very well. Today I want to look at what post-exile life looks like in Israel. We've said over and over again that there's kind of three main movements within Israel, or maybe you could add a fourth if you want to count post-exile, but you've got from the movement out of Egypt until the death of the last judge, and then you have the rule of kings beginning with Saul and David, and then extending through the end of the lines of the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, and ending with each of their exiles. That period of time concludes. So with Israel and Samaria, it ends when the Assyrians take them out. With Judah, it ends when the Babylonians take them out. And we looked at the really there's a tremendous amount of revelation or literature written right at the close of that section and leading into exile. Maybe more than any other time period, is this outpouring of God revealing what will in the future take place. Each of them go off into exile, and then slowly and in different waves or stages, Israel comes back. And what we're doing is we're setting the stage for the New Testament. And what I want to walk you guys through today is what I think one of the most important pieces that is often neglected. And so we kind of we're going to get into some really specific texts today, but want to take a step back and look at the spread of redemptive history, and remind ourselves, so we're not getting so sucked down into what's going on in the city of Susa at this time in Esther's life. That's good to do, but it's also good to step back and say, what's the big picture and what are we missing with regards to the big picture? One of the things that we have followed from Genesis chapter 3 is, how can a holy God dwell amongst a holy people? Or an unholy people, sinful people. How can a holy God live amongst a sinful people? That's what it is. And at the end of Revelation 21, we get that tension finally resolved. God says, I will be their God, they will be my people, and I will dwell with them. So from Genesis 3 to Revelation 21, that's one of the main plot lines or tensions that needs to be resolved. One of the others, and tied to that, is this question of how is it that God does dwell in some sense with his people. Now, we're going to start back in Exodus, and I know that is first trimester, but I then want to show you 2 or 3 more movements beyond that impact Israel coming back in the land. So I trust you have your Bibles and are studiously taking notes. But if you're not, please do so. Open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 19. I know that is way back in the first trimester. What we find in Exodus 19 is the first appearance of the glory of God. Exodus 19:16, on the morning of the 3rd day there was thunder and lightning and a thick cloud in the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke, because Yahweh had descended on it in fire. And the smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. Later on, this is described as that first descending of the screensaver just went on. That's helpful. This is seen as the first coming down of the glory of God. And then if you go to the end of the book, so that's the first occurrence of God's glory. And then at the end of the book, they have built the tabernacle, and this tabernacle is that place that God will specially dwell with his people. Remember in class we got the big model of it down and looked at the holy place and the holy of holy place and the altar and the table of incense and all of that. When that is completed, Exodus 40, verse 34 and 35 says, so this is very, very important. It says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the Lord filled the tabernacle, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it. The glory of the Lord filled the temple. So we're beginning to see, or I want you to begin to see a pattern here. When God comes into a temple or temple-like structure, his glory descends. Usually it's accompanied by like smoke or cloud and deep darkness, and no other people are allowed to be in there. So the pattern you just saw in Exodus 40, verse 34 and 35, the cloud of God's glory comes down, it fills. Moses wasn't able to dwell there. So that's the theme. When God comes and dwells among a people, his glory fills that place, and no sinful fallen human person can dwell in that same place. God's glory then travels with the tabernacle through all of their wilderness wandering in or across the Jordan into the promised land and a couple different places there, but finally comes to rest in Jerusalem. David wants to build a house for it. Remember, God tells him, you're not the person to do that. Your son will do that. And so turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 6. This is the end of Solomon. Very similar account in, I believe, 1 Kings. 2 Chronicles chapter 5. Beginning, verse 13 is kind of long, but kind of beginning in the middle of verse 13. And when the song was raised with trumpets and cymbals and other musical instruments in praise to Yahweh, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Now notice this, the temple's been completed. Now note what happens. The house of Yahweh was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of Yahweh filled the house of God. So what you're seeing is the same exact scene that's played out in Exodus 40 is playing out in 2 Chronicles chapter 5. The place where God is to dwell is completed. His glory cloud comes into it, fills all of it, and sinful man cannot stand in his presence. Now, you might say, all right, I get it. Where are we going with this? Well, turn to Ezekiel. Remember, our mnemonic for remembering the order of the major prophets is Jesus Lord every day, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. Ezekiel is one of my favorite books. Sadly, we will not be able to spend hardly any time on it. But Ezekiel is hanging out with the exiles near the Kabar Canal. And he's one of the exiles in the 5th year, exiled in the 5th year of King Jehoiachin. And he is given a vision. The glory of Yahweh shows up. It's one of the most incredible scenes in all the Old Testament, where God shows up in essentially what seems to be a war chariot of sorts. There's wheels within wheels that are spinning. There are sapphires. He's seated above a throne. It's incredible. I'd encourage you to read Ezekiel chapter 1 if you want more detail on that. But Ezekiel begins to see into the temple. Now go to Ezekiel chapter 8. I want you to see this. Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 2. He's taken up by God, verse 1. He says, "Then I looked, and behold, the form that had the appearance of a man. Below what appeared to be his waist was fire. And above his waist was something like the appearance of brightness and gleaming metal." Verse 4. "And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the vision that I saw." So that same vision that he sees in chapter 1 recurs in chapter 8. And he is given access, chapter 8, to in this vision, he's brought into the temple, into the holy place. And of chapter 9, verse 3, he says, "Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house." So the scene is that of inside the Holy of Holies, the cherubim over the mercy seat. And he sees what we call like the woeful retreat of the glory of God. Lifts up from the mercy seat and sits above the cherubs, and then moves to the doorposts. And then chapter 10, verse 1, "That I looked and behold, on the expanse was over the heads of the cherubim. There appeared above them something like sapphire in appearance and like a throne." And so God is seated above the cherub. Verse 4, "And the glory of Yahweh went up from the cherub to the threshold of the house, and the house was filled with a cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of Yahweh." So the scene is God's glory rising up from where it has dwelt since the days of Moses on the mercy seat of the ark in the holy of holy place. Picks up from the seat, picks up to the cherubim or the angels, moves to the threshold, moves to the outer courts. And in chapter 11, verse 22, this is the last big movement. Then the cherubim, so these are the messengers carrying the war chariot, as it were. Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them. And the glory of Yahweh went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east of the city. That would be the Mount of Olives. So the picture here is God right before, a few years before exile, saying that their sin had become so grievous in his sight that he would not dwell among them any longer. And so Isaiah, in this prophetic vision, is given a glimpse into God's woeful retreat out of Israel. So the God that has dwelt with Israel from the days of Moses no longer dwells with them. He is no longer pleased to dwell on the mercy seat or in the Holy of Holies or in the holy place or in the temple complex, but he leaves and goes east. Now we could talk about all the symbolism of going east. If you remember what is always symbolic of east is always not good. They go to exile. There were a few years where they would have been offering sacrifice, it's hard to tell whether they actually were properly keeping Day of Atonement, but if they were, they would have gone in once a year to sprinkle blood on the mercy seat, and you'd think the high priest would notice that the glory of God was no longer there. They go to exile, they come back, and then in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, they're told by foreign kings, you can go back and you can rebuild. And you find in the days of Ezra a rebuilding of the temple. So this is picking up right at the end of where Daniel leaves off. Daniel he makes it to the decree of Cyrus, we believe, but he lived under Darius. Darius's decree forms chapter 6 of Ezra. And so they rebuild this temple. So they go back, they rebuild the temple in the same spot where the tabernacle had been, where the Solomonic temple had been. And in Ezra 6, verse 13, you would think that we would find what scene? Well, we'd think we'd find they completed the work. The smoke of the glory cloud came to dwell. It filled the temple with his glory, and no man could stand before it. But look at this. Ezra 6, verse 13. Then according to the word sent by King Darius, the king, Tetani, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar, Bozenai, and their associates did with all diligence what Darius the king had ordered them. And the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the son of Iddo. They finished their building by decree of the Lord of Israel, or the God of Israel, and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house, this is speaking of the temple, this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. And the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated and dedicated the house of God with joy. They offered on the dedication of the house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes. They set up the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their divisions in the service of God at Jerusalem, as is written in the book of Moses. What was missing? In fact, I don't know of anywhere in all of the return where we find the return of the glory of God. We should be so used to that pattern by now that account should startle us. That they are not back from exile yet. So while they are coming back in waves and in stages, and they are building a shadow of what was before, Israel is not fully back from exile. Israel will not be fully back from exile until God brings her fully back from exile. And so she can rebuild Jerusalem's walls, and our next assignment will probably have to do with that, looking at the book of Nehemiah. But she doesn't come back. And so you might say, well, when does the glory of God return? And for this, we will dip out of the Old Testament just for a minute. I won't rob any of Mr. Hatcher's thunder from next year. But turn to the book of the Gospel of John. Chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word, it's talking about Jesus Christ, the Word became flesh, and he tabernacled among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. When does the glory come back to Israel? It comes back in the tabernacle that is the flesh of Christ. He is the glory of God himself. And he can bring all of his people out of exile. So keep in mind when we're reading those post-exilic books or post-exile, so the Ezras of the world or the Nehemiahs of the world, or even some of the minor prophets, keep in mind that while, yes, some things are being regained, it will not be the same until Christ comes back as the glory of God.